Very good afternoon, very good morning to Korea and EU, Europe, respectively. I welcome you all to this special lecture to be given by Dr. Wolfgang Pape. I'd like to introduce the special lecture series. This special lecture series is sponsored by KIEP, Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, which is a think tank of the Korean government under the name of GPAS program, Graduate Program on Area Studies. And KIEP was very kind to provide us with this support for the last 10 to 15 years. And I'd like to express my special thanks to President Kim Hung-jong. Dr. Kim is present here because Dr. Wolfgang Pape, Dr. Kim, and me are common friends for more than 20 years. So I have invited him, and he, despite his very tight schedule, he was able to make it to share his insights with our students. Thank you very much. And this event is a lecture series provided and hosted by the EU Center at Korea University. The EU Center at Korea University was designated by the European Union as a center, EU Jangmoneh Center of Excellence, right? So we have been running the EU Center for 4 years before we were designated as the EU Center of Excellence. And I'm really very happy to continue this under this name. I'd like to introduce also to Professor Sebastian Belsick from University of Bochum, Germany. He is also a common friend of us, and he and me are doing a common project at the moment, and we are meeting actually next week again. So he made it, and time he could find some time to participate in this special lecture. Let me turn to Dr. Wolfgang Pape to introduce him. Dr. Wolfgang Pape is a long-lasting friend of mine and a very well-known scholar and policymaker to the Korean society. He's better known to other countries in this part of the world. He was stationed several years in Japan. He's very fluent in Japanese language as well. And he's also known and has many friends in China as well. The first encounter with him from my side was about 23 years ago when I was visiting Brussels. I was in some conference, and we came to talk about global affairs and so on. And he first mentioned about omnilateralism. Song, what do you think about omnilateralism? And we have been intensifying the discussion for more than 2 decades. But I was really very happy to hear that he was able to complete his book project about omnilateralism. And I thought that this is a really very excellent opportunity to invite him and to let him share his insights with my students as well as some colleagues of us. So actually, the omnilateralism, and I asked him to focus on the European Union's role in this long journey towards omnilateralism. So he very kindly accepted my offer, and I like to thank Wolfgang so tremendously. Wolfgang, why don't you start now?
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Park. And I should join you in thanking KIEP as well, KIEP, It's an honor to have President Kim with us here, because I was there already as a fellow some 10 years ago, and they were a very good host to me, gave me a chance to get to know Korea and even learn about, at the time, development policies all over the world. That was a chance for me because Hillary Clinton was coming to Busan at that time, and I was preparing a study in that context. So thanks to both of you. My idea today is to introduce omnilateralism in the context of the books that I just published. And I'm using here the EU as some kind of a stepping stone to see how the EU can contribute to this idea of omnilateralism by not blocking it, because some academics call it a hindering obstacle even to omnilateralism, but I see it as a stepping stone. So let me go forward on my slides here. I hope it works fine. It does. Most of us in the world are very much concerned now with the pandemic. And you know from probably your Greek lesson or whatever context that it comes from pandemos, concerning everybody, concerning all people. That's the origin of the word pandemic. And we know that the WHO on 11th of March 2020 declared this pandemic, although already in December 2019, the year before actually, at the end of the previous year, there had been early warnings coming to the WHO from somewhere else. But this somewhere else was not a nation, because it was Taipei. Taipei announced already by email to the WHO in December 2019 that there's a problem with people coming from Wuhan. They had a flight coming in from Wuhan, which was, after some examination, realized that there was a danger coming from China with certain viruses, which were already known apparently then in Taipei. But the WHO, being a United Nations institution, could not officially recognize this email as being a proper source for the information. So they didn't send it out to the other members. It was not known to the world before the January then, and studies started only late. This actually led to a kind of a time lag in reactions, and it actually cost millions of lives, if we see it in retrospective now, and trillions of euro in damages for the world economy because of this time lag of information. For me, this shows how the national diplomats and the national identity can be an obstacle which has enormous damage to the world, because apparently it was at the national level that this information was not immediately given further to the WHO. Within the country, they stopped it, and I'll let you follow from there which country it was and all the political implication of that. For me, this is a good example to show how the United Nations are actually working still only within this framework of nations and don't have any communication directly from the local level to the global level, as we see. Although in the Charter of the United Nations, we talk about we the peoples, but the peoples actually are not clearly represented in the United Nations. It's only the nations, and that's a basic issue for me, which we need to study in order to realize how to overcome the multilateral system to go to the omnilateral. If you want to have more detail on this, I have here in my slides the sources of this information. I certainly can give it later to you if you want to. We know in Europe that the national borders are some kind of a historical aberration. We are trying to overcome the national borders, and we have done that since the start of the European Union, at first, of course, in different institutional makeups. But now we know with the pandemic again, that the national borders actually is not so much the real border. Very often now with the pandemic in particular, we see that the identity, even in terms of welfare, sanitary issues, can be much closer to home. If you look at this map here, you'll see that, for instance, within countries, there are enormous differences. And to my surprise, honestly, in Finland, there's even a province still that has no case of corona. That's why it's blue here in the north of Finland. But if you look at other places, the border actually, national border, which is here in black, does not really show a difference in terms of concern with pandemics. It is very often the provincial or even local places which are different within a country. For instance, around Paris, obviously, there's less of a problem than in Paris itself. Paris has a very high infection rate here. And you see, this is, sorry, there's something too fast here. The issue here for me is that even at the welfare level, sanitary issues and so on, the local and provincial level is becoming more important again. And this is very clearly the case actually with the pandemic spreading all over the world, but still having local and provincial differences. And the national differences are not that clear always. That's why we start now a new discussion about governance levels within the EU. Some people feel, local officials should have more of an influence in decision making. Here we see it, for instance, at the moment, the distribution of the vaccination, for instance, is done at local level, whereas the EU as such is buying the vaccinations for the whole of the EU for all 27 member states together. So we have different levels of action in the EU, which are very important in terms of welfare. But it's not only in terms of welfare. We see it as well in the context of warfare. Wars are done traditionally between nations. That's what we learned from the past. And since Westphalia, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, we know the difficulties are always at the borders of the nation. Since we have hard borders, since 1648 in particular, the nation state has more or less created this national fixation on the borders, which is particularly strong in Europe in historic terms. But nowadays, even in Asia, there is still less of an identity with a nation than we Westerners often think. And this was recently made clear again in the Financial Times just 3 weeks ago, when they said the US failed to understand Afghanistan, and that's why they had problems with their warfare there, because we Westerners still tend to assume that a government should be equated with a nation. So government and nation is still the Western concept of understanding, but it shows, particular in East Asia, that the history of the nation is not really a very long history, and the identity with a nation in Asia is much less traditionally than within Europe. And Europe, of course, has imposed this understanding of the nation through its colonization of the particular African and as well Asian and American continent. Europe has imposed the nation on the other parts of the world. So the nation state is not always a very strong concept in the world. So we have to see a little bit closer what we call multi-level governance. Let's be very clear. We have to start with governance, and particularly when we think of democracy at the local level. There we can have very direct democracy. Everybody knows everything, and there's no need for mediation by any social media, whatever. The information at the local village is very close to each other. Proximity makes it possible that people can judge directly. Then the next level is usually a kind of a province. In different parts of the world, it's differently called. I mentioned here the Japanese context, or the Dodofuken. But in Germany, for instance, it's the Länder. We have regions in Belgium and sorry, I don't know the details in Korea, but in Korea as well, you have sub-national units from the local all the way to the national. And these districts, of course, have to play more and more a role. We see that with the pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, in Europe, for instance. Of course, for us nowadays, the nation is still the main identity, and that's the problem. And I see that as an aberration since the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. This aberration of the nation being absolute in terms of sovereignty has enormous cost still nowadays. I mentioned already the problem we had with wars over borders. Most of the borders, actually national borders, are more or less drawn by the military. And we see nowadays with globalization on the one hand and subsidiarity going down to the lower level, a loss of the sovereignty of nations up as well as downstream. And then beyond the nation is what we call the region being the next step in the multilateral governance up to organizations like ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in Asia. You have the AU in Africa. You have Mercosur in Latin America. You have NAFTA, which has now changed its name since Trump tried to impose a little bit more own unilateral interest there, the UMSCA. And we have as well with Korea, the trilateral of Japan, China, and Korea, which is quite interesting, but unfortunately not very strong at the moment. So these are intergovernmental regional cooperation makeups. And only the Europeans, actually, with the European Union, are supranational. Supra meaning beyond the national in terms of having their own competences, their own authority. And nowadays we call it more and more even sovereignty or autonomy in the European context, because they can pool the sovereignty of member states for their own purposes. And this leads to exclusive competences at European level. So the European Union has in its government system certain competences which are only exercised by the European level, not at member states. Think of, for instance, trade issues. We have the trade FTA with Korea and Japan, for instance, most recently with Japan only. And these trade issues, these trade negotiations are done within exclusive competence by the EU as such. It's not the member states, it's not Macron, it's not Merkel or Draghi who negotiate, it's the EU as such. And this exclusive competence is the core competence in the supranational system in the European case. But we have to go back into history to understand why Europe went to this kind of a supranational system, because we understood that conflicts between nations have been more or less created because of the wars between the nations in the Westphalian system. Borders were drawn up mainly by military power, military might, and they were made, of course, with weapons of steel, and energy was important there as well. If you look at this picture here, the photo actually goes back to the end of the Second World War, when the Americans stormed onto Hiroshima, the small island, and that was taken as a first island of Japan. And this characterizes the problem of wars, because wars until recently, at least now with cyber attacks and other more digital means of war, it's changing a little bit. But at the time, in the Second World War in particular, the energy and steel was the most important part to go for war. And this, of course, led then to the what we call the coal and steel community in Europe, which is bringing together coal and steel for Schuman, Robert Schuman, who was the leader at the time to help Germany and France come together. With his Schuman Declaration, made it very clear: la solidarité manifestera que toute guerre devient impossible So war becomes impossible once you have a common administration of coal and steel industries in your countries. And that was a start actually of the development of peace within Europe, at least within Europe, of the integration process, which then led to what we have now in the EU. This Schuman Declaration, of course, was led to the Europe Day, which was just a week ago or a couple of days ago. The 9th of May is always celebrated here in Europe as Europe Day. And that in the end brought us to the Peace Nobel Prize in 2012 for the EU, because it was recognized that the EU, with its system to overcome borders between nations, has more or less manifested the possibility that peace is possible even between nations when you come together in cooperation and integration. And this was recognized even by President Obama, who himself, of course, with the Peace Nobel Prize, knew what it's all about. You probably have seen this scheme of the European Union before. This is an old picture, actually. You see 2007, it was a summit in Germany, but the basic scheme has not changed very much. So you have a little bit like Montesquieu already explained it in the past, that there is an executive institution, which is the European Commission. Then you have at the legislative level, the European Parliament and the Council, and you have the Court of Justice for the judiciary. But this actually is in practice much more complicated. If you look at this system, which I put together a little bit to see more the actual supranational governance of the EU, you have to see the decision shaping and the decision making, which I differentiate here in this context. Very important are the group of experts, the expertise that is brought in, and they officially, of course, are coming together very often in the EESC, the European Economic and Social Committee, as well as the Committee of the Region, to represent the region which I mentioned before as the provinces. So the region in this context have a different meaning. And of course, at the center of all that is the executive, the commission, which alone proposes laws. That's a particular feature of the European Union, that it's a commission which is executive and as well the monopoly of legislative proposals. This is very particular, and this is often seen as the so-called democratic deficit of the EU system. But I would add problem as well as with the Council, which brings together the member states at several different levels, from the head of states and governments, as well as almost daily the ambassadors of member states meeting here just next door to me, actually. And this council actually, and I put a black box on top of it, it's very often seen as a black box because it's very intransparent. It's interesting now, the building of the council looks very transparent. It's made up of actually old wooden windows put together to make it look as if you can look through into the meeting room, but this is only an illusion. I go by there almost every day, so even in the evening when their lights are on, you cannot see anything what's going on in there. It's still a black box because the decision made and the discussions are very rarely declared to the outside openly, and it's always the participants, mainly the heads of state and government, that bring afterwards in press conferences their own point of view, and they finally often declare it's Brussels who is the Black Peter, and if there's something going wrong, they can easily say in the discussions they had to follow up the others. But it's interesting to realize that, well, and this is particular to the European Union, that here you have about 80% of decisions made in the Council by the member states in consensus. It's not easily done, but sometimes it takes what we call marathon sessions during the nights to find a consensus. But nevertheless, this idea of having a consensus is very important, because you don't have then a minority later on claiming that they left out with their own understanding of the problem. And this consensus building as a democratic means to come together, I think is very important, and we should be more aware of that, which is, in my understanding, and maybe here I'm a little bit prejudiced, different to the Anglo-Saxon understanding of democracy, where you always have this two-party system of majority against minorities. And you might remember that Alexis de Tocqueville talked about the American democracy already and saw it as a tyranny of the majority. In some cases, particularly under Trump and the Brexit issue, you see the difficulty at national level in particular to find clear decisions if you follow only majority in terms of quantity over quality of decision making. But this we might take up later in the discussion if there's further interest. Of course, we have as well the European Parliament, the EP here, which is very important and is increasing its strength in the process of what we call co-decision with the Council. One point I want to a little bit focus here is the comitology, a strange word. It means there are lots, more than 300 committees meeting regularly, and they give the final touch to the legislation. And here I have to add, from my own personal experience in the Commission, it's very often the Commission that has a final word. And this is very difficult to understand, because the Commission here more or less always chairs the meetings of these final writing of the legislative, executive provisions. And this comitology is in very little terms transparent. So the black box could be extended to comitology here as well. I mentioned already the member state sovereignty is being pooled by the EU in order to have the competence on customs union in particular. Of course, you might remember tariffs and anti-dumping procedures, WTO. Here, it's always the EU, not member states. And the whole common commercial policy is made at EU level. I mentioned already the Korea-EU FTA, which is part of this commercial policy. The competition law as well is very important at EU level. It's an exclusive competence, where the issue of state aid, for instance, it's quite interesting that the EU was using the concept of state aid against Apple in Ireland, and it's still in court, the issue, because Ireland gave tax privileges to Apple in order to attract investments of GAFA, Apple and other of the big technology companies to come to Ireland. But this is seen as being state aid against competition law. It's against the even playing field that certain countries give tax advantages to companies in order to attract their investment. And this is still at court, but it's a big case, and it's very important for the European understanding of competition policy. Of course, the monetary policy within the Eurozone is done at EU level. The European Central Bank is very crucial in this context. And even some aspects of the fishery policy as well is exclusive to the EU. But the issue of sovereignty is not only an issue within the EU. As I mentioned at the very beginning with the pandemic and the problem of the bottleneck at national level for information to go up into the global governance system, that means from Wuhan, WHO actually, here the issue of national sovereignty is important. And I say the national sovereignty is now an illusion, as well as the nation as such is an aberration since the Peace of Westphalia. It was already Thomas Hobbes who said that there are enormous problems if we if we don't reduce the idea of sovereignty, we will never have a real international system. Any international agreement actually reduces the sovereignty of the particular nations involved. So in the Dictionary of International Relations, you find the very simple slogan by Graham Evans that sovereignty leads to international anarchy. And this, I think, is a very strong expression of the problem sovereignty still poses in the global governance. But we see very clearly the loss of sovereignty now. Upstream, that means to the higher level of government, globalization has, of course, reduced sovereignty very highly, particularly in communication, in finance, in trade. But the whole global commons, which means, for instance, climate change, environment, and so, show how much we are interdependent in our system, in our understanding of the global affairs. But from the nation downstream as well, that means down to the level of province, to the level of local governance as well. We have the so-called subsidiarity. You should do things at the lowest level possible in order to be close to the citizen in democratic understanding. And here we see as well in the Anglo-Saxon system more and more the understanding of devolution, as they call it. And some of the provinces, I mentioned here, of course, Scotland, Catalonia in Spain, Okinawa in Japan. I could even add Bavaria in Germany. We see more and more this kind of self-determination, and they are striving for some kind of autonomy. The whole issue of federalization, particularly here in Belgium, and they talk about co-federalization, and they use the word in different contexts here. In Belgium in particular, between Wallonia and Flanders, is a very strong and very heated debate. We see that as well with the discussion of reform in Japan. That's different levels of governance, different level of administration are more and more being put into question now. So it's not only within the EU, it's worldwide that this national sovereignty is becoming an illusion because people realize the problems they have if absolute level of sovereignty is only at the nation. So when we move in the multi-level governance system up to omnilateral, we have to see how it's determined beyond the so-called multilateral. We have seen already the first 4 levels here, particularly beyond the nation. We have the EU as the supranational stepping stone, as I call it. And let's see how far we go beyond that. We call it the multilateral system. Some people even say the EU is a multilateral understanding of governance, but I would not call it multilateral, to be honest. I don't think it's seen with 27, you're not multi, in my understanding at least. Maybe my Latin is not good enough for that. But nevertheless, when we look at the United Nations, we see more and more the problem of this treating nations equally or not. The most obvious case, of course, is with the Security Council, where I have the 5 permanent members, which have enormous power, but they very rarely are united at all. And even issues like now Myanmar are very difficult to be treated at the United Nations Security Council. We have seen already the problem of multilateralism with the WHO, that there's no communication from the local up to the global level. We have recent discussions in the WHO, WTO as well, about the structure of the global governance there. So I'm proposing to go beyond the multilateral into the omnilateral. Omni meaning omnibus, literally for and by all. But you know, the bus, as we use it, I think even in the Korean language, Japanese as well, is a vehicle for all. And we even have the Airbus. That's why I put a little plane here, which is a big airplane for many people, or even all people if possible. the idea is to bring into the system not only the nations as such, but stakeholders in a more general context. Of course, the problem is how to select these stakeholders, and we can go into more detail on that later. So we see that the nations have been associated with their votes in the United Nations. They're voting in a formal system of decision making, and it's always the nations who are members and the nations who can only vote. But we haven't got really the voices being formally recognized in the system as such. And when I call it omnilateral, that means I have to open up the system to these voices beyond the nations. So the problems of the current multilateral order are mainly that there is a systemic incoherence in policymaking, and there are lots of ad hoc creations of economic, environmental, and social systems. The COP, the climate change problems, the Convention of the Parties, Conference of the Parties, started already early on with having more and more NGOs and civil society participation. But already in Copenhagen, which was kind of a failure, the COP Copenhagen showed that the nation cannot decide really only, and we need more and more the civil society and expertise to come and join the discussions about climate change, which then led to Paris, where the influence was much greater of the different non-state parties, the non-official participants. They were not officially recognized, but de facto their influence was very strong. And we see that Paris has gone much further than any of the other conferences of the COP so far. So Paris is a positive example of this move towards multilateral system, because here we see that the incoherence of the system is becoming obvious, and there has to be additional expertise and NGO participation that helps to move forward on these issues. The other problem with the multilateral order is short-termism and the lack of instruments for more comprehensive vision in the long term to contribute to this crisis of legitimacy of institutions. The United Nations has enormous questions about its legitimacy, and I mentioned already the UN Security Council, among other things. But you can see that historically, with the so-called Battle of Seattle in 1999, we saw for the first time that the civil society, the so-called NGO voices outside the conference, it was a WTO conference at ministerial level, had so much of an influence that the conference had to be stopped and they couldn't continue at the time. So it was more or less that the NGO voices at the time became stronger than the WTO votes. And this movement from votes to voices, I think, is part of what I call omnilateralization. If you look at the democratic aspects of the multi-level governance system, we have to be aware that it's easy to have direct participation, direct democracy at local level, because proximity allows everybody to be informed, and they can easily decide about a football stadium or theater or kindergarten to be put up in your neighborhood. But the more abstract, the more comprehensive issues of climate change and environment, for instance, cannot be decided at local level. Of course, our action have an impact, but it's the impact of local decisions are much smaller. And so we have at global level enormous necessity and enormous influence of the so-called market media. The dependence on the information for the average citizen is very difficult, because the big issues he cannot really himself experience. When we talk about enormous difficulties and very comprehensive issues like climate change, we need expertise. And that's another aspect which I want to bring in here is the media influence in decision-making. The higher we get in decision-making in the multi-level system, the more we depend on media. And the media at the moment with their market orientation, think of the GAFA in the Western context or the BATX in the Chinese context, sees enormous giants of communication with their market dominance, monopolies in a way, are very strongly influencing the public opinion. And if you have direct votes already at national level, it can be very dangerous because they control very often the public opinion. I'm tempted here, of course, to mention the 2016 election in the United States with Trump coming up as well at the same time, Brexit decision that shows how much the media have an influence on the voters. And if you have a simple system of majority voting, and particularly in presidential systems, this danger is even more evident than in the more parliamentary system like we have in most continental, European continental systems here. The direct influence of the media can be very dangerous. And I dare say that Brexit and Trump were negative examples of direct democracy. And that's why I say we can have more direct democracy at a local level, but the higher we get in the system, and particularly at national, regional, and global level of governance, we can afford direct participation hardly at all, because the issues are too complicated and the dependence on the media is too strong. So we have to bring in other factors. And here I think the stakeholder issue, the legitimate stakeholders with their voices have to be heard more than only the national decision-making with their voices by the diplomats in New York, for instance. So just to kind of sum up, I think the time is running out as well. We need, for efficient, legitimate transborder governance, we need more input from expertise and from so-called civil society, NGOs, and so on. And we are fully aware that there is no territorial actor that can secure alone the issues of sustainable development, security, and even peace and equity are objectives which are very difficult to be only seen in the context of national decision-making. And it's the EU white paper already at the time I was part of this team on governance here with the President Prodi of the European Commission. At that level already, the territorial actor cannot secure really the long-term possibilities of policy making to a positive effect. So global issues need global. This is very obvious nowadays, particularly with climate change, the internet. You have the high sea, but you have as well the low sea if you want the mining on the bed of the sea now is a big issue. You have outer space as well as cyberspace. You have the pandemic issues. You have the issues of poverty. All these issues cannot be purely done by territorial actors. They are issues of global dimension which have to be done at global governance level. I think I should end here for the moment and open up to the discussion, because otherwise time is running out, and I'm sure there are lots of dissenting voices and dissenting votes even, and I'm looking forward to hear from the others with their different ideas in this context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wolfgang. 감사합니다. Thank you. Let us open to the question and answer session. We have received one question beforehand, and I am sure that Ms. Park Hye-yeon is here. So Hye-yeon Park, why don't you have direct communication with Dr. Wolfgang Pape, asking your questions. Turn on your microphone and please ask your question directly.
Yes, sir. Could you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, thank you for your lecture. It was a great opportunity to hear from you. And now I feel like my questions was made beforehand, so it feels like a bit off topic, but I only had the basic knowledge of omnilateralism. And it says to encompass non-Western values and systems, if I'm correct. And I actually had a few questions, but the first question was, if you have any specific kind of non-Western value, do you think that should be taken into account? Or if we should revive those kind of values, or even when those countries do not pursue them anymore in favor of Western system or value? Like oftentimes in a lot of Eastern countries, those values were discontinued by like other factors, or maybe from like cultural revolution in China. And another question was, do you propose like to strengthen the UN to make intergovernmental system, or do you propose to start from the scratch and make totally different organization? But I think you dealt the later part in your lecture a bit. Thank you very much.
Should I go directly?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Ms. Park, for a very interesting but very profound question. Of course, the value system is an issue you can discuss in enormous different contexts. I'm fully aware that it's a Western value system, as far as my education, of course, was very much in the West, and I only went to the East actually as a university student. So maybe my basic values are, of course, formed here and shaped in the West. I was at high school in the US, and it made it even now, in my perspective, worse. But nowadays we are aware as well of what we call Westlessness. You might have heard the word. Wolfgang Ischinger at the Munich conference used it last year in February, because he saw, particularly under Trump at the time still, that the West is not united anymore. The West doesn't have this common base anymore, and we look forward to the East to learn from others. And I think my omnilateral idea is as well learning from the others, not only from the East, to be honest. I mentioned Islamic banking, and I mentioned the reconciliation process we saw in South Africa, which are learning processes for us in the West. And we learn more than that, the whole understanding of recycling, for instance, in a nature is much closer to the Buddhist thinking than to our Western linear thinking. So these Western values, if I may say so, are put into question more and more by our own experience in the world now. And I feel omnilateralism is a way to bring in these non-Western ideas and values to better understanding and finding better solutions for our global problems. Here, I think you can mention as well that the United Nations, for instance, is more or less originally made up of the Anglo-Saxons. It was Churchill and Roosevelt and then Truman who came up with the idea of the United Nations following from the League of Nations. And in San Francisco at the time, it was very dominant of the Western powers, not only the United Nations Security Council, then finally, who shaped the whole body and the whole body of global governance. Of multilateralism as such is a Western concept. And of course, multilateralism is based on the nation. And here again, the nation is something that was imposed on the world with colonization of the other continents, physically even. And this, I think, showed that the Western values are put into question. And I think there are good reasons to learn from the others now and more input from non-Western value systems and cultures and practices as well. So talking about values and systems, you said the discontinuation of the Cultural Revolution in China. Of course, China, the communist system is not a Chinese system. Communism, Karl Marx and all that came actually from the neighboring country here, from Germany. And I dare say that it's not very Chinese, the understanding. But on the other hand, I have a feeling that the individualism we have particularly in the understanding of capitalism has gone too far, and we can learn from more collective thinking in other cultures, particularly in East Asia again. So this learning from the others, I think is very important, and this openness, I think, is necessary for omnilateralism. I don't know if I answered your question in this context. And just in very simple terms, United Nations being intergovernmental, certainly yes, it's purely intergovernmental, and that's exactly the problem. So they have to open up to the other non-state players, and I mentioned civil society, NGOs, but as well opening up to even business interests. For instance, the GAFA and the BATX, for me, the big tech should be part of the governance system, not controlling it by controlling the public opinion through their media, but being responsible, accountability, stakeholders in the system. They should be part of the governance. Yes.
Okay, let us open the floor to the wider audience. If you have any questions or comments, please do it by asking questions directly to Dr. Wolfgang. We have here Professor Belsick and Dr. Kim Eun-jung from KIP, Professor Jung Se-won from Bugyeong National University, and Dr. Yoon Sung-han from Korea University. If you have some comments or questions, please raise right away. Yes, Dr. Kim, President of KIP, please.
Yes, very quick questions to Wolfgang. Thank you very much for your sharing your idea of omnilateralism. The question is very short one. In the year of the COVID-19, we observed that the nation and the national sovereignties has gained weight, and then have a lot of the things to do in the level of the nation state now. And how plausible your idea of omnilateralism apply for this new era of the okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, President Kim. This is, of course, a very relevant and up-to-date issue now. I started off with Europe, not the map of the national borders, but the borders of the impact of the COVID in provincial and even local differences. You remember that Paris, for instance, maybe I can go back even to the slide. Paris is much more concentrated with cases of COVID than the countryside, and you have very often across national borders even similar case numbers. So the national border actually, not only in Europe, but even outside Europe, is not any obstacle to the penetration of COVID, to the spread of COVID. And we see, and the word pandemic actually means that everybody's concerned. There is no possibility that the national border stops COVID. We have to see the problem with COVID, and we had a similar case, which, sorry, as a parallel might not sound very convincing, with the mad cow disease in the early years of 2000 coming from the UK. We saw that the problem was really spreading through communication that is possible. If you have communication with the territorial region, then the spread of the virus or the mad cow disease, bacteria, whatever, is very strong. And this is not always the case within the nation only. It crosses nations. We have done at the time with the Mad-Cow disease, for instance, a regionalization within Alsace. You might know that the German and French border are being contested very often in wars and so on. So Alsace is a region that brings in both sides of the River Rhine in France and in Germany. For the Mad-Cow disease, we saw that as one region that has to be isolated by not trading cows from that region with outside, either in Germany nor in France. So it was not the national border that was closed, it was a region around this communication of diseases in a way. And I think the same is now happening partly already, for instance, in the so-called Moselle region of German Saarland and next door the province of France, Moselle, where they realized that COVID is being transmitted within this region almost equally, but outside it should be isolated. So you see that the national border has less relevance actually, and we should see more the certain level of infection in provinces or even local areas. That's why in Germany, for instance, they even isolated small places for COVID reasons to make sure that the COVID would not spread outside this intensive region within the country. It's not the national border. The problem is we still think only in terms of national border because it's an administrative border at highest level. But this doesn't make sense in the COVID context. So the nationalization that is seen along with COVID, particularly because of the attribution of vaccination, is artificial. It doesn't reflect really the need of vaccination in different parts of the world. I don't know.
However, I like to bring a few more things into the same discussion. Number one is, at least temporarily, we have seen in case of Germany, Italy, and France, the border was closed, right? At least temporarily, in the beginning of the COVID pandemic, to cut off the influx of the infection. Number two is quite currently we see a relatively big divide in vaccination of the people. The so-called vaccine nationalism is observed, some people say, right? So these are probably what President Kim has mentioned and how to cope with that. Of course, we have to take into consideration that there are a few regional and global attempts to cope with this COVID-19, because we know COVAX system is there, and the EU has a kind of collective system for procuring vaccines and also the test kits. But on the other side, we have this kind of increasing nationalism as well in procuring vaccines. So how to cope with these problems? That is what I'd like to have more insight from you.
No, thank you. Of course, this is a very difficult problem. I'm fully aware, but we have to realize that the nation, in terms of administration, in terms of being isolated, is still our fixed point. That's historical. But I want to explain, and I think with the Mad-Cow disease, we saw examples already, that this doesn't make sense because the national border is not an absolute border. COVID wouldn't spread otherwise. And we have to see that we have to fight the COVID where it is a problem. It's not a problem in one nation and not in the other nation. It's a problem that is communicated from one place to another place. And this has to be seen a little bit, let's fight it where it is, not only at national border. You're right, we had seen that member states closed their national borders, but it didn't prevent the appearance of the virus within the nation. It's not necessarily at the national border that there is really the transition for the virus. We know, for instance, that in Europe, the main problem was in a small ski resort in the Alps, where the British came together and they were feeding, and then they went back even to Iceland and other places. So if we can isolate the COVID and other pandemic or epidemic issues at a local place, it would be much more effective than just borders. If you have an island country like Japan, they can easily say, okay, we close the borders, because it would be difficult to see any fish boats. Some boats came in nevertheless. But with continental countries coming together and communicating over borders anyway, you cannot isolate the country as such. The fact is that we have administrations, of course, which are easily using the national border, because as a tradition, we have the border posts, we have clear lines there, which is not always the case around a town or whatever. Police would be difficult to have a clear-cut border put up around the town or a small village, although they know that is the main super spreaders being there for skiing. That is very difficult to do. But as a nation is still our fixed point, unfortunately, I would dare say here. And Europe is somewhat drawn in between this possibility of regionalization or bringing it down to localization, and still having this identity of the nation as being the main administrative function here.
Okay. Wolfgang, if I may jump in here.
From Bochum,
yes, from Bochum, located in Munich currently.
Oh, okay.
Corona. Hello, Wolfgang. Many thanks for your presentation, and welcome. Wolfgang, you differentiated between the levels of governance and actors, right? And actors that, from in your concept of omnilateralism, that refers also to non-state actors. So here, the citizens are important. I mean, this has been discussed in the context of global governance literature, also of the United Nations, some years ago, in the context of representative democracy. And the question is, how do you solve the issue of legitimacy, of political legitimacy? You stated that those actors need to be legitimate, but how do we know? And in the end, it's the states that have the legitimacy, which is obviously historically comes from the Westphalian system, sure, but what would then be the next step? I mean, what actually is your model then about? Is it, you said it's hybrid? Is this then the EU model? So we have intergovernmentalism and supranationalism. But more concrete, how does the issue of legitimacy can be solved when we talk of non-state actors and citizens?
Thank you very much, Sebastian. You get into the core of the issue. That's the legitimacy, how to prove legitimacy of stakeholders. I include nations, or you use the word state. I use the word nation here because state has a double meaning. We talk about member states in the EU, and some people don't recognize, even in the Japanese language, they have problems to make a difference here. Koreans, I think, and Chinese have a similar issue here. But talking about nations, so far the nation is the only formal actor in the context of United Nations, as the term already says. And to bring in other stakeholders, non-state or non-nation stakeholders, you have to find a system for the legitimacy. And there I'm using what we defined in the white paper on governance here in the EU, the various criteria for good governance. And we have to see here how far the various NGO groups, non-government, in the Chinese context, they talk about the ONGOs, the official non-government, and there are CONGOs, the government recognized official, and so on. How these stakeholders can be certified or made accountable to be part of the very difficult process. We had that already in the discussion. I remember Pascal Lamy at the time, he was my boss here in Brussels. We tried to find out how we can bring in various groups of civil society into the EU decision-making, for instance. So far, they are only in the ECOC, the European Economic and Social Committee. How to bring them in and how to prove them. It's very difficult. And we have to find out, for instance, what is their background? What are they representing? Do they have internally a democratic makeup or not? Who is financing them? Who is behind it? And to get a balance, you know, you cannot have everybody come in. You have to do a choice somebody physically already. And this is very difficult to do. Actually, in my book, I refer very much, I don't know if you can see that. I should put on some light here. On Terry Mcdonald's book on global stakeholder democracy. It's a she, Terry Mcdonald, actually, she refers to, I was in touch with her later. She is an academic in Australia. And she puts up some kind of system how to select these stakeholders to make them legitimate in the context of global governance. But it's not only a matter of global governance. I mean, as I mentioned, at global level, you need more and more expertise, civil society, and so on. At local level, you can have direct democracy decision-making, what we call a referenda or plebiscite or whatever. But at a higher level, and for me already at national level, referenda are very dangerous. You see that in presidential system like Trump, might be even next year in France as well, there might be a problem with Le Pen. See, I personally, maybe it sounds very elitist, I personally have problem with presidential system because I feel that the majority of the people cannot judge who should be the right person to have this power as a president of a nation. I think there should be at least a parliamentary system in between. But if you look closer at development of democracy, even representative democracy has more and more issues now because a representation has its own function already. The national parliament very often is not really representing clearly the people as such. And I looked into you might have seen the book of John Keane on the life and death of democracy. He sees democracy developing from representative democracy to monetary democracy, that there's a more or less ongoing permanent monitoring of the democratic system, of the governance. And I think that's a future development as well for democracy at higher level, global, national, and even regional EU level, that we have more permanent monitoring of the decision-making, not by clicking all the time that crowd decision-making is the only way. We have to see how the various legitimate stakeholders, whenever there's an issue where stakeholders are involved, that they have some kind of voice in the system. And it's not only votes, but it's voices more and more. And I think this is very important, but technology allows this nowadays. That's a difference from the past. We don't have this idea anymore that you send somebody as a parliamentarian far away to Washington or to Seoul, and then he is disconnected from his some script that more permanently be monitored by often have a stake at the issue. And this, I think, is the future of democracies, is monetary, not monetary, monetary. Monetary, of course, is a democracy which we have seen partly in the United States with Trump. But this development of democracy towards a monetary democracy, I think, is a beyond the purely monetary democracy.
Wolfgang, from a slightly different perspective, I thought the omnilateralism can be a kind of providing potential conflict between legitimacy and efficiency. because omnilateralism, as you said, means by and for all, right? So establishing the system to represent all the interests of all the people, and also by all the people, I mean represented by all the people, will kind of sacrifice the efficiency and effectiveness of the whole system. So how to reconcile between the two, efficiency and legitimacy, because omnilateralism, slightly contrary to Sebastian's view, I thought is enhancing the legitimacy. We establish a system representing all people's interests and also represented by all people, all stakeholders. But I thought on the other side, the efficiency or effectiveness can be sacrificed. So how do you see that?
Efficiency, of course, I would even make a difference between efficiency and effectiveness. Efficiency, of course, is how much you input to get a certain result, whereas the effectiveness is focusing on the result. Problem, the more people, the more differences you have, the efficiency can be less, I admit fully. But the problem here is, for me, the effect of the decision, how it can be implemented easily. Because if you have more people involved, particularly people who are concerned, again, pandemic, we are concerned as a people, the more you can implement it as well. That's another thing which, in my understanding, is the Anglo-Saxon democracy of minority and majority has a problem here, because it's very difficult to implement if there's a minority dissenting still, saying, no, we are not part of it. So that's why I mentioned, for instance, the European Council, in the Council of Ministers, for instance, you have more or less 80% of consensus building for the decision, which is very important to implement it. With the look at the efficiency, there might be a problem, I admit, but the effect of the effectiveness of the decision being implemented then easily, I think is more important. And this distinction should be clear. And when I say omnibus, literally from Latin, meaning for all and by all, I think the for all is more important than by all. For me, it is not the quantity of people, you know, the idea of crowd decision, crowd democracy, even they call it sometimes now. You can have on the internet more or less majorities easily put up, depending on the media, how they influence people and all that. With the echo chambers and all these problems, you have extremes very often on the internet, which is difficult to bring together. And I think we have to bring together people rather than splitting them up in more extreme small niches. And this is possible if you see the effectiveness for all, that meaning those really concerned stakeholders should have more of a voice and more influence than only those who are, for instance, like, you know, the smallest nation, Nauru, which is only, I think, 145,000 of the population of China, but they have in the General Assembly of the United Nations the same vote. They have one vote as a nation, like China has one vote. This doesn't reflect reality. So the idea of the nation being treated equal is nonsense in this context. And obviously, there are certain concerns, like, for instance, the rising of the sea because of climate change, where the small island nation of Nauru is much more concerned than than countries like Austria, for instance, which is completely land-based and doesn't have any problem with the sea around it. So you have to see stakeholders being concerned, decides use for all. The difficulty of the issue here is how to, like Sebastian just mentioned, to select these stakeholders for their legitimacy on the particular issue involved. I don't know.
Okay,
if I
yeah.
May I myself put a question, if I may?
Yeah, have communication with the students and participants. Yes.
In particular, I'm always very interested because I call myself a European, and I'm always trying to find out if people in Asia could identify beyond their nation with something like Asia or so. Among the students or among the audience here, who would say that they are rather Asians than belonging to a particular nation? Is there some kind of identity with Asia?
You like to hear the voices of young generation more than my old generation, right?
No, I'm sure the academics amongst you, they are so open-minded, they can call themselves cosmopolitan or whatever. But the identity with Asia, is that growing? Because we have now in Asia more and more regional groupings like the RCEP, most recently being signed in last December. And the trilateral maybe even is moving forward. And Korea. So the national border might be less than before, but I admit vaccination nationalism seems to be particularly strong in Asia.
Sorry to interrupt, Professor. We had 2 questions from the chat board, so please.
I know. I saw Park Gaeun's question. Gaeun, are you still working? Or because I thought that she left already, but I saw she was working. So Gaeun Park, if you are available, then why don't you use this as an opportunity to ask a question to Dr. Wolfgang Pape?
Hello, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I was in an environment where I couldn't talk. So thank you so much for the lecture. I was just curious that because many people are proposing minilateralism as an alternative to multilateralism, I was wondering where your alternative, which is omnilateralism, fits into this scenario. Do you think that these two things can be compatible, or are they in conflict with each other?
Sorry, I didn't quite.
So Gaeun, was that you were asking about the minilateralism?
Mini.
And,
yes, that was my question.
And omnilateralism. So whether the two can be complementary, right? That was your question.
Yes, Professor, that was my question. Thank you.
Thank you for this linguistic problem. I have some problem with the word minilateralism, to be honest, because lateral means sided, and mini is a reduction in quantity. So for me, at least with my little Latin that is left with me, I wouldn't combine these two at all. There are, of course, maybe I should go through the lateralism that's being used. There's unilateralism, there's bilateralism, there's trilateralism, there's plurilateralism, there's multilateralism, and now I add the omnilateralism. And Pascal Lamy recently used even the combination of Greek and Latin by saying polylateralism, which I think is linguistically a little bit odd combination, but that's the difficult issue here. Minilateralism, in my understanding, means just a small group of people, or states or countries coming together. This, of course, is in contrast to what I propose, omni being the more, not only in terms of quantity, but as well as quality. It's not just meaning we have more nations, but it's meaning bring more people, more concerned people from the different nations into the decision-making process. So minilateralism for me is not a progress at all. It's a falling back to less involvement into the global decision-making. So I would say it's not very much favored by my understanding of what we need at global level in particular.
Okay. The last question I have seen on chatbot is probably was given by Hyunjun Park. And I suspect that this question was already discussed during the Q&A session. Hyunjun Park, do you have any special additional question?
No, Professor.
So it was discussed, right? Thank you very much. Is there any student who would have big headache if he or she has no opportunity to ask a question today? So let us invite the last question today. If you have any question, please turn on your microphone or raise your hands and ask a question. The last opportunity. It appears that we have discussed out. Actually, Wolfgang, I think this topic is really very difficult, complex, but I really congratulate you with all my heart to have completed the book. And Sebastian and Dr. Kim and Professor Chung and Professor Yoon and me are doing a project at the moment, which will be completed next year. And we plan to have a conference in Brussels next year, April or May. And we pretty much hope that the COVID-19 pandemic is over. And let's have let's continue our discussion over bottles of beer and glasses of wine, right? If the situation is, yes, normalized, we can do that in Brussels. Sebastian, do you agree?
I fully agree.
Dr. Kim, thank you very much for your coming, and Wolfgang, really, I greatly appreciate for your time and energy to share your insights with students of my department and also some of colleagues. And I hope that this is not the last time, but it's the new beginning of our academic journey together, right? Thank you very much. And thank you all the students participating. And I greatly appreciate your appearance and also your input to the discussions. Thank you very much. So see you next time. Wolfgang.